Alrighty, good afternoon. Welcome back to Data-Driven Wildfire Research. It looks like we have a nice assortment of people in the audience. I am pleased we have Krishna Rao as our speaker today. He is a PhD student in the Earth System Science, and he is also part of the Remote Sensing Eco-Hydrology group led by Professor Alex Konings. He is also one of our esteemed Stanford data science scholars. And today he will share some of his work on improving our understanding of wildfire risk using data-driven vegetation moisture estimates. So without further ado, take it away, Krishna. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Derek. Really nice to be here with everyone. Screen share is working. Yes, cool. Thank you. Yes, so data-driven vegetation moisture estimation. I'm going to be talking about that and then just using that as really a tool for understanding wildfire risk. Definitely wouldn't have been possible to do this work without my collaborators, some of whom are here. So great, big thanks to them. So before I start, I'd just like to say that at any point of the meeting, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, clarification. There's no pressure at all. At any time you can do that. No worries. Okay. And to force you to unmute for the first time, I'll ask a question on the next slide. All right. So whenever I think about wildfire risk, I think about this sign. This is a picture I took sometime in Utah, and it shows that the fire danger there is low on that day. And beside it is a bear with wearing jeans pants. Does anyone know the name of this bear? Trivia question. Someone
Smokey.
tell me. Smokey. Yes, the Smokey bear tells us the danger on that day as low. But what many people don't realize is that wildfire danger, just to get that this adjective simple rating of low to extreme, it's actually a very complex process with multiple teams working on it. Just as an example model which gives out fire danger, here is the method inside underneath the National Fire Danger Rating System. Now, look, going through the boxes and arrows are not important. The motivation is to just show that to motivate how complex such models of wildfire danger can be. I'm sorry for this. You can still hear me, right? Yeah, sorry about that. So the reason I'm showing here is not to go through all of these different factors, but just to focus on one key metric inside here called live fuel moisture. This is defined as the amount of plant water per unit dry biomass. So it just tells how wet or dry the trees are. And the reason I'm going to be focusing this talk on live fuel moisture is twofold. Firstly, as the fire danger rating system themselves say that it's a subjective estimate. We don't really know how to quantify that in the real world. The second reason why we are interested in that is that it's affecting all the three components of wildfire danger: the ignition properties, the spread, and the energy release. So not only is that it's very important for wildfire danger, but also that we don't really understand it very well. So that's why we are going to be focusing on live fuel moisture today.
I don't want footprints on my wall.
The outline for the talk would be just first going over how we can map live fuel moisture using remote sensing. The second section, we will go into an investigation of ecosystem vulnerability to wildfires using that live fuel moisture. And finally, we'll conclude with looking at the impacts of live fuel moisture on wildfire risk and not just wildfires. Okay, so going back to that subjective estimate of live fuel moisture content, what does that mean? So currently, all the state-of-the-art models estimate vegetation moisture using meteorology. By that, I mean we take a meteorological index, for example, in this case, Canadian drought code. And the y-axis is the vegetation moisture. And you can see that for this species, there is like kind of an okay relationship. As the drought code increases, the moisture decreases. But then in this species, there's actually a very poor predictor. Meteorology has almost no relationship to vegetation moisture. So, and this is pretty bad. Actually mapping every species, it's not possible. So coming up with these curves for every species is not realistic. So we took a different approach. Like many things in our group, we took a data-driven approach to come over this. But why, going back to the same example, why is there a difference between these species-related relationships? Well, one reason is that species traits are different. Here, for example, I've shown a tree on the left with deep roots having access to the groundwater table, whereas the tree on the right with shallow root doesn't. And if there is a condition of high vapor pressure deficit, in other words, dry air, the tree on the left can probably stay wet for a longer time because it has deeper roots, whereas the tree on the right can get dried down. So this kind of difference in species traits can lead to different vegetation moisture for the same meteorological condition at the top. And this is just one such example. You can imagine other species traits like stomatal characteristics or xylem tolerance can also lead to difference in the vegetation moisture for the same meteorological dryness. Okay. So to overcome this challenge, we took a data-driven approach, as I just said, and use remote sensing to do so, and specifically microwave remote sensing. So microwaves are just like light waves. We cannot see them. It's at very higher orders of wavelengths than light. And the reason we use microwave is that it's very sensitive to water. So whenever there is an emission of microwave, it gets reflected by the water, in this case, the water inside the trees. And we can then infer the amount of vegetation moisture using this principle shown over here of reflection. And this is again repeated on the next slide here. So vegetation water can be inferred from microwave reflection. We've also known from various other studies that light and infrared reflection can tell us about the amount of biomass in a terrestrial surface. And by combining both of these, we can get plant water divided by dry biomass, which is life fuel moisture. So this is our variable of interest. And by combining this, we can get to that. But there is a challenge. It's not that easy. There is some kind of cross sensitivities too. Microwave reflection is also related to biomass, and sometimes light and infrared reflection is also related to plant water with non-linearities involved. So to disentangle these non-linearities and to get to the life fuel moisture, we use a neural network to combine microwave radar and optical remote sensing to come up with this life fuel moisture estimations. And this network, of course, network is as good as only as good as the data which is available to train it. And I'm so thankful for the United States Forest Service in collecting all of the ground truth data. It's shown here on the top. They painstakingly put together all of this geolocated measurements of sampled life fuel moisture content all across the Western United States, shown here in the red dots. And the table is it's like very well maintained, cleaned, publicly available. So it's very kudos to their effort to maintaining this resource for us, for everybody. I'm just saying I'm thankful that they are available for us. So using the neural network, we combine microwave and optical remote sensing, train it on this data set, and now we are no more confined to just ground measured life fuel moisture, but we can actually have spatially contiguous as well as temporally consistent record of live fuel moisture. On the right, you can see the evolution of live fuel moisture content seasonally for the Western US. And if you're interested in exploring this more, there's a web app available at tinyurl.com/forest dryness. You can zoom in, explore, and interactively play with it. But yeah, so now this gives us a chance to ask interesting questions, because now we have observationally driven estimates of vegetation moisture. We have compared this to some meteorologically derived ones, and they're far more accurate. So we are no longer required to assume the relationship between meteorology and vegetation moisture as shown over here. Right? So
Krishna, quick question.
Yeah.
So that looks fabulous, by the way. I want to play with that later on. What is the uncertainty? So you guys had great data from the Forest Service, and you're doing your neural network and training the model. So what would you say the uncertainty is? Whether is it a percentage, or can you give an idea of the uncertainty in these beautiful pictures?
I don't know the uncertainty. It's really sad that we are able to derive mean estimates, but not really uncertainties. We have sources of uncertainties. We have looked at, if we don't have information about some observations, say optical remote sensing, then how much would the accuracy change? But then we've actually not been able to quantify the uncertainty with the point estimate of live fuel moisture content. Does Alex have a point to add to that?
Well, just to be clear, I mean, we have cross-validated with the data, and so that gives us an estimate of uncertainty. And Krishna, I think the last thing you said sounded like we didn't even do our very basic due diligence, and that's not true at all. We tried to cross-validate, and we tried to cross-validate as vigorously as possible with holding out certain sites, especially that weren't used for training. But I think what Krishna is getting at is that there's also just scale issues. For example, right? We're using measurements at 250 meter resolution, but the fuel moisture data are at individual branch scale, and those types of things we don't have any other data to really get the kind of estimate of uncertainty that we would really like to have. But that doesn't mean that we haven't tested the data at all. It's just been very limited by the available information.
Yeah, thanks for that, both of you. Thank you. I was just curious. Always my eye of being a scientist to sort of say what kind of uncertainty or bounds we want to place. I hate calling it error, but uncertainty I think is the better description.
Yeah.
It looks fantastic.
Okay, thanks. And I just another clarification. I just put this as neural network. There's a lot of things going on in that. So if you're if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask about that as well. Okay, coming to the end of the first section, now we have observationally derived estimates of vegetation moisture, allowing us to test different hypotheses related to wildfire vulnerability, one of which is presented at the next slide. So take a piece of land. Let's say it has trees and shrubs as shown over here. And let's say that this is a drought sensitive ecosystem where if there is high vapor pressure deficit in that ecosystem experienced by that ecosystem, they will get dry. The trees over there will get dry because they are the nature of the trees over there is that they are drought sensitive. Giving a link to the previous image of deep and shallow root trees, these would be the shallow root trees over here. Okay, and if plants dry, they may lead to area burned if an ignition source is accompanied with that. So to summarize, in drought sensitive ecosystems, when there is high vapor pressure deficit, the plants might dry, and if the plants are dry, there are more fuels. If there is more fuel, the area might burn. To contrast this with the drought insensitive ecosystem, for the same high vapor pressure deficit, only some plants might dry down. And if only some plants might dry down, only some areas might get burned. This is a very simple schematic to show the contrast between how drought sensitivity can lead to different wildfire hazards in different ecosystems. Okay. And now that we have these observationally derived live fuel moisture, we can actually characterize how much is an ecosystem's drought sensitivity or drought insensitivity. And we did that using a regression as shown over here. The left side is plant water anomaly or vegetation moisture anomaly is regressed on climate linearly with a slope and an intercept term. I should be clear that this is a simplified example. Actually, there are lags sometimes between climate and plant anomalies because plant water has some kind of a memory associated with it. So the actual regression takes into account these lagged components of lagged effects of climate and plant as well. Now, just looking at the drought sensitivity, which is M over here, we can see that when we train this across the Western USA, that there is a wide variation in the plant water sensitivity to climate anomalies. There are places with a slope of 0, which means they are very less sensitive to climate anomalies. Now, these can be that, again, on the first few slides I showed species where even if the drought code increases, the vegetation moisture is not increasing at all. So the green ones can be like that. And the pink areas here represent ecosystems which are very sensitive to water limitation. So already we see some hotspots over here. For example, Southern Sierra Nevada seems to be drought sensitive in that it's dark pink. Northern Sierra Nevada seems to be drought insensitive because it is dark green. And a lot of areas in the Oregon too seem to have some hotspots for drought sensitivity. Now, taking just one step further, now this shows that there is a big, enormous variation in plant water sensitivity, but testing our hypothesis that does this lead to different exposures to wildfire hazard, we will first take just the dark green areas here, which means the areas which are very less sensitive to drought. These are just plant water sensitivity very close to 0. And let's see if burned area increases with vapor pressure deficit and by how much.
Hey, Krishna, I think you have a question from Marshall.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, Krishna, quick question. So your outcome here is your predicted fuel moisture from the ML model, right?
Yes.
So this is using Sentinel as input. So you're estimating then these cell level regressions off a pretty short time series?
Yes. This is from a 5-year data record.
And your unit of observation is like the month or something? Like what's your temporal unit? Like I guess another way of asking the question is, given that short time series, how much uncertainty would you expect in this sort of map here?
So that's a very good question. So we have seen, when this map has been constructed, we have seen at least 5 dry down events, 5 years of dry down. And this is at bi-monthly time scale, 2 weeks for every timestamp. So I think just for a snapshot of the entire 2015 to 2020, I think this could be a pretty good representative map for plant water sensitivity, but we don't really know how this changes in time or something. This is just like a snapshot for this entire 5-year interval. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks.
But yeah, great point. It's just from the last, it's from 2016 to 2020. This map is representative of that time span. Okay, so taking this one step further, looking at the impact of plant water sensitivity on burned area, we are going to be just focusing on the most drought insensitive regions, so only the green areas. And we see that in those areas, burned area has increased with vapor pressure deficit. So x-axis is vapor pressure deficit and y-axis is burned area. Each point here refers to just 1 year. So there are 20 points here. And you can see that in years where vapor pressure deficit was high, or in years which had more aridity, burned area was high in those years, even in the drought insensitive regions. So VPD does have an effect on burned area, even in the drought insensitive ecosystems. But when we compare this to the drought sensitive ecosystems, the bright pink areas, and the previous slide, we see that burned area actually increases enormously with an increase in vapor pressure deficit. The slope is actually more than double than the one on the left here. So what does this show? This is almost like in the extremes of the drought sensitive spectrum. On the one side, we have that burned area increases by a little bit in drought insensitive regions, but in the other hand, in the drought sensitive regions, burned area increases by a lot. Okay, and these are just the extremes, but putting all of the middle points together, we see almost like a consistent increase. So here, the x-axis is plant water sensitivity, again, like greens to pinks. And the y-axis is the slope between burned area and vapor pressure deficit. So here is like a low slope, and here is a very high slope. And you can see that it's almost like with increase in plant water sensitivity, the burned area sensitivity increases. So what does this mean? It's a strong suggestion that the evidence suggests that the link between burned area and vapor pressure deficit is tightly regulated by plant water sensitivity, or in other words, ecosystem vulnerability to wildfires is driven by how much they are sensitive to water limitation, as shown in this plot. I want to make sure everyone understands this because there's a very key piece for the next section. So I'll take a brief pause here. If you have any questions or clarifications, please let me know.
I guess I'll just add a comment and you can agree with it, I hope. That's a pretty amazing regression. So I mean, thinking statistically speaking, that means that 71% of the variance of the burned area sensitivity is represented by this PWS sensitivity. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay, so let's move forward. So, go ahead.
A question real quick. So it looked like in the plot of the plant water sensitivity that there were lots of areas that were kind of outside of the traditional wildfire zone that included, Central Valley and lots of places that are ag and places that are really deserts.
Yes.
And a lot of the low sensitivity places are places I don't think of as having much wildfire activity. How do they fit into this?
So that's a great question. So this map has firstly been masked for only natural vegetation environments. So croplands have actually been masked out. Croplands are not part of this map. But the reason we still see many pixels here is that there is a lot of white over there, which has been masked out. And the green over there from the land cover map refers to some kind of a shrubland over there. So I think, for the first part of your question, the croplands are not part of this map that is shown here. And how does this lead to or our impression of wildfire risk when many of these regions we don't even see as hotspots or think about wildfire risk there, especially the arid regions in Nevada, Arizona, and so on. So I want to be clear that drought sensitivity is only one factor of wildfire hazard. It's not the only factor. Fuel availability definitely plays a very big role. And of course, human activity and other ignition sources also play a big role. So I want to make sure I don't overstate the implications here. It is only one effect of wildfire hazard that we are investigating here.
Could you say something about how the actual amount of wildfire scales with the plant water sensitivity? So, I mean, you showed how much it changes as a consequence of VPD.
Yeah. So that's a good point. If plants are more sensitive, is the burned area itself more over there, not just the increase in burned area. So I've seen that regression, and it is true actually. Burned area is more in regions with high plant water sensitivity, but then at that point, I think we also concoct it with other drivers of burned area. So that's why I'm not explaining the variation in burned area, just the increase in burned area. But yeah, short answer is
Okay.
This figure, if it had just burned area on the y-axis, the increase is still somewhat like this.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so going to the third part of the talk, until now we have seen the effect of plant water sensitivity on wildfire hazard, just the area burned, but then does it have an effect on wildfire risk is the question. Whenever I think about wildfire risk, I like to think about this triangle of risk, which is in this case defined as the concurrence of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. In the wildfire framework, this might be hazard can be something like how much area burns. Exposure can be how proximal are humans to the burned area. Definitely not the only one, but one of these metrics. Vulnerability can be something like what are the effects of the burned area on the assets of interest, humans or human structures, and so on. We already saw from the previous section that plant water sensitivity is directly linked to wildfire hazard, but we don't know about exposure and vulnerability. But what we do know is that the wildland-urban interface affects exposure and vulnerability, both of them. It tells how many humans and human structures are close to them, and also there are studies which show that they might be more vulnerable. So is there any link between the plant water sensitivity and the wildland-urban interface, or more specifically, the demographic characteristics of the wildland-urban interface? So that we get to know, okay, like plant water sensitivity and burned area is cool, but is this affecting us as humans? So I'll show the evidence for that, but just before I go into that and see some of my friends here, so just for them, I'll define what the wildland-urban interface is. Many of you may not know. So it is defined as the zone of transition between the wildland and human developed areas, and they can look like one of these two pictures mostly. So on the left side, you can see that it has a very densely vegetated area with a very sparse density of human structures. And on the right side, you can see almost like an interface, almost like an edge of a city where there are human structures on one side and dense vegetation on the other, bordering just that. So both of these can be examples of wildland-urban interface. Okay, and one other scaffolding I need to construct before I show you the result is that going back to our previous version of previous section's result, that plant water sensitivity and burned areas increases are related. If you had squinted, probably some of you did hard enough, it doesn't seem to be like a direct one-to-one increase monotonically. You can see that there is like almost no increase over here, and then moderate increase of the slope, and then a sharp increase. So based on this subjective definitions, not like well thought about, just looking at this relationship, you can probably classify this into 3 hazard zones: low hazard and medium hazard and high hazard, where the slope is very high. So the question is, how has the human population in the wildland-urban interface evolved in all of these 3 different hazard zones? And that can give us an idea of how much are we being exposed to that wildfire risk, and not just the burned area. We humans is what I mean. So the giving that result, so the wildland-urban interface population from 1990 to 2010 has doubled. This is not shown by us, this is shown by previous studies. And that doubling corresponds to an increase from 10 million people in the Western United States wildland urban interface to 20 million people. So there's a big increase. But splitting this into the 3 different hazard zones that we already saw from the previous slide, as defined by plant water sensitivity, you see that the low hazard zone has almost been on track with the entire WUI area, entire wildland urban interface area. The medium hazard zone is slightly less increase. It's 95%. I forgot to tell, this axis clipped at 90%. It's not from 0. The idea is to compare these different bars to the overall WUI region so that we get the differential increase in each hazard zones clearly. But the point of concern is that in the high hazard zones within the wildland urban interface, the increase in human population in the Western United States has been 160%. So to put this in perspective, this 160% corresponds to an increase of 1.5 million. And to put that into scale, that corresponds to population of San Francisco and Seattle combined. So this plot shows that 1.5 million people, this plot shows that there is like a disproportionately high increase in the wildland urban interface population in the high hazard zones. And that's a big point of concern, because until now we've been thinking, I think that WUI has been considered just like WUI, and here we show that actually within WUI, the human population evolution has not been the same everywhere. It's higher towards the higher regions of the plant water sensitivity spectrum. And this should this will probably have implications on our quantified wildfire risk zones so far, because we have not tracked the interplay between wildland urban interface and plant water sensitivity or ecosystem vulnerability until now. So yeah, this is the last slide of the section. Before we go into questions, I'll just briefly talk about what we are working on now and ask some questions to you so that we have a stimulating discussion. Why are people moving into the most vulnerable regions of the wildland urban interface? I don't know the answer to that. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please let me know. We still don't understand the relative effects of vegetation moisture on ignition and spread. I am working on that, but it's still work in progress. This work so far that I presented is just the effect on burned area. It's not on ignition or spread. From data related questions, is it possible to get a longer record of vegetation moisture maps? I think Marshall asked the question about how representative is this. So to answer such questions, we might be interested in a longer record of these maps, and also spatial resolution if we are confined to small study areas. Currently it's at 250 meters. So can we improve that spatial resolution? And lastly, wildfire. Now, live fuel moisture has very different effects on wildfire hazard based on understory or overstory effects of fuel. And we currently don't understand the output of the model of the neural network. We don't know if it's understory or overstory, and any studies to disentangle that might also help. So yeah, I hope this was enough food for thought for people to ask questions, comments or suggestions, and answer my own questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Krishna. That was great. And yeah, I think you opened many cans of worms, which is really the whole point of this this seminar series. So I'll open the floor for questions. But yeah, I think we got some great questions that Krishna threw at us to start off with. So who'd like to go first? Bruce, your mic's off. Do you want to contribute a question?
Well, I do, but people had their hand up. But anyway, I just wanted to say, would it be possible to distinguish between the vegetation that people plant when they move in these areas versus the vegetation that might attract them? And one possibility is that you have two patterns of WUI settlement. One which puts you right at the edge of the wildland area and the other that intermingles. I'm going to guess, not that I'm a gardener or know much about vegetation, but I'm going to guess that when you intersperse with the vegetation, you're more likely to have replanted, whereas if you move next to it, you're more likely to be attracted by it. There is a whole literature about why people move into these areas, and I'll leave out all the political economic reasons it's done. But I'm just, in terms of vegetation management, would it make sense to sort of separate out those two different areas to see if the same result holds? I don't know whether you have enough observations to do that, but I have a feeling there's some replacement effect and then there's some attraction effect. But I'm just trying to figure out ways that you might be able to leverage that.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. I think, yeah, based on what we are planting, I don't even know if we are planting the drought sensitive ones or the drought insensitive ones, and studying the effects of that can actually be pretty exciting. I think we are slightly limited by the spatial resolution of what we see. We are seeing at almost like a block scale at 250 meters, not at the stand scale, which is each individual tree. But that can actually be an interesting application for increasing the spatial resolution. I'll need to think more. Does anyone else have a related point or an answer to that? I'll be curious to hear.
You probably could use higher resolution data to answer Bruce's question, just using optical data and some machine learning or something, because you'd only have to map the WUI, and then you could link that back to the fuel moisture content data. Given though, I want to maybe, Krishna, see if you can maybe expand a little bit for Bruce on your point about what we actually know and are working on for, drought insensitive versus drought sensitive, and linking the maps to, oh, I'm going to plant this or that. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. I think it maybe is relevant also to Bruce's question.
Yeah, that's true. So currently we are still seeing if there is any like spatial patterns in which wildfires evolve, which will probably say something about if a fire grows here, does this grow everywhere randomly? Most certainly not, but it will grow in some areas more than the other. And we are seeing if there are some kind of fuels which it does not like and it goes around it or something. So those kind of inferences can probably, similar methods can help us understand the effects of different kinds of vegetation types on wildfire risk.
Yeah, that would make me a little nervous to go to that step, because based on the class, we brought down people that do the modeling and the fire people, and you'd have to take into account the prevailing wind directions and upslope versus downslope. There's a whole bunch of stuff. The topography matters as well. So you're getting into a fairly complex modeling process. So you got to be careful if you go that direction. It'd be great to know that stuff, Krishna, don't get me wrong, but I think you're getting into a tougher modeling challenge there.
Yeah.
Good points. Anyone else have a question or a comment or a new topic to take this in?
Well, how about just, I don't know, Krishna, whether you looked at the California map, but I'm kind of curious as to, where, do you see any patterns? Because we've had terrible wildfires in the north in the last few years, which is within the time span that you're looking at. And are those areas in which this drought, the sensitivity to drought is, and the type of vegetation is more problematic? I guess what I'm getting at is, you take an area like the Santa Cruz area that just burned, and the coastal areas, which historically have never had a lot of fires. And it's kind of like with the zombie forest talk that we heard last week. I wonder if there's these transitions where certain kind of vegetation was fine for the particular period, but now it's shifting. Is that something that maybe, if not zombie forests, it'd be zombie flowers or bushes or whatever, but this notion that of transition zones as being particularly problematic, is that something that you might potentially get into?
Yes, there is a line of research that I'm thinking about, is just understanding this drought sensitivity. What causes that? We just have quantified that, but then is it caused by plants which are supposed to be there but are which are supposed to not be there but are there, like zombie flowers? Or is it caused by the different traits that we saw from the first few slides, like deeper roots, shallow roots, and so on? And I'm definitely considering that. Yeah, I'm trying to get a more scientific understanding of what's driving that drought sensitivity.
Great. Other questions or comments? Michael.
Yeah, I'll just ask a question. Do you have any sense, Krishna, for how field treatments might impact plant water sensitivity? Because I mean, typically in a field treatment, you go in and take out some of the lower level plants that are not going to have the deepest roots, and you might leave more mature trees that might be reaching shallow groundwater. And I'm curious if you've looked at whether there's any sensitivity, and you could see field treatments occurring at a scale that's maybe relevant to your pixel size. But I'm just curious if you've looked at that at all.
That's a very good point. I have not looked at it at all, but that's a very good point. Yes, are the fuel treatments being effective? Not just from the wildfire perspective, just from the wildfire hazard perspective. If we are removing the most drought sensitive ones, I actually don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if the data is at like how easy it would be to port the data, but there's pretty readily available data for at least prescribed fire treatments in a system called PFIRS that would allow you to sort of look at footprints and see if you see change before and after in the data.
Okay. Very good point. Yeah, thanks for that. I'll look into that.
Great question, Michael. I have a question for you, Krishna. And it comes back to your last slide. You said something about the need for more historical data, and I think Marshall brought that up. Can you at least elaborate on what is available? So I'm thinking that the forest, the in situ data must be significant, going back decades. And satellite data obviously is maturing and moving the opposite direction. So can you comment on that? And then I guess I have a follow. I'll ask you to answer that. Follow-up question to that as well.
So the state-of-the-art satellites are only since 2016 onwards. The actual satellites have been from 1970 or once, the traditional ones like Landsat, but then the ones which we use on the high resolution microwave spectrum, they're on 2016 onwards only. That's why I think if we did this study 30 years from now, we might have a longer record, but there's no physical way to do the hindcasting unless we do some kind of an intelligent reconstruction. There are studies which have able to do that with varying levels of accuracies. There's one on canopy water which uses hyperspectral remote sensing, but then that's like a special technique of remote sensing, but then actually regresses it on traditional remote sensing like Landsat, and then back constructs it in time. I think if we put enough time and minds and effort, that's doable. It's just that that's not the first thing which comes to my mind to answer the question. That's why I'm not currently focusing on the extending that temporal record.
Yeah, and I wasn't intending to say that's for you, but yeah, to finish your doctorate. I guess, yeah, you sort of answered my second question, was what is possible for reconstructing. To me, I'm not as much in the data science you, but it seems almost like an inverse problem. If you have this data and you have a lot of sparse data going back in time, and I was also thinking about hyperspectral, how much could you say about the past 3 decades?
Right.
If you were to do the inverse problem and go back? And obviously there would be uncertainty bounds on top of that, but it seems like it might yield some insights. And again, that's not a problem necessarily for you, but it seems like there might be a real data problem there that exists to go back in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I ask a related question to Derek's and maybe ties into Bruce's? How much, so if you take your map of plant water sensitivity and it's estimated off short time series, best you can do, I mean, how much of that is predicted by observables? Like if you just knew 5 things about the forest on the ground, like you could sort of predict variation in this. And could some of those observables possibly explain why you see a lot of people showing up in these apparently high risk environments? I mean, maybe they're managed differently by it. Maybe it's a jurisdictional thing. Like, have you guys done like just in a simple predictive model? Like how well would that work?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's one of the motivations for me to look into that. I don't know the drivers of plant water sensitivity at all. Only hypotheses are there. But what you said in the big end of the point is actually very interesting, and I didn't think about that. So it's not just like ecological factors which might drive plant water sensitivity, but also judicial or sociological factors, like you said about jurisdiction. And that's those kind of variables or those kind of factors is something that I didn't even think about. That ties in the point of Bruce Kane, who's making like, are we planting those trees? So that's a really interesting point. I should, when I do work on that, which is going to be very soon, I will make sure to include these other non-ecological factors as well to study the variation in plant water sensitivity.
Great. Anyone have a final question before we close out? We're almost at 1:20. Anyone have a final question to close us out?
Well, just to put it in people's minds, you know, we've been working, we've got a project with the Marin JPA that's taking care of Michael, protecting him. And I have a question, which is, when do you feel confident enough about a paper or findings to actually present it to people that have responsibility for other people's lives? You know, that's what I want to know, because on the one hand, there's a side of me that says, wow, we should be telling people these things when we know them. The other side of me knows, wait a minute, there's a problem with that, because sometimes we think we know something, but we don't know it. And I think it's something, it's an interesting problem that will come up with the sustainability school. And I just think we all ought to think about it, because there's a type 1 and a type 2 error. The type 1 error is that you have something that could be protecting people that you don't let out until there have been, you know, terrible fire season, but there's a type 2 error too. So I don't know. I mean, I just throw it out there with absolutely no guidance.
That's a great thought, Bruce. Anyone want to comment on it? I think that's a great thought, and something a lot of us should be thinking about, whether you're doing wildfire or not. How do you communicate your science to the public? And when do you do it? And to what extent? Or, you know, you publish something and then people run with it and, you know, infer something you didn't even imply or didn't intend in what you wrote. So there's a lot of that. Anyone have a comment on that? It's really a great way to end off, because people can be thinking about it in the weeks and months to come. All right, well, I'd like to thank then Krishna again for his time and his insightful talk and his great work. And thank you all for attending. Again, encourage you to advocate and advertise this with your cohorts. Next week, we'll have a little bit of a change of pace. Dr. Mary Pernicki will talk about smoke exposure. So we'll be thinking of data and wildfires from a very different vantage point next week. So I encourage you to come and invite your friends to come. But thank you, Krishna. Give me a little real applause as well as the symbol there. And thanks for everyone's attendance. We'll see you again next week. Take care.